Let's walk down there.
Friday on Road to the White House, you'll travel on the campaign trail with Senator Al Gore. Earlier this week, C-SPAN crews traveled with the Democratic vice presidential candidate on the campaign trail with stops in Pennsylvania and Delaware. We will bring you highlights from Ross Perot's news conference about his political future as well. And you'll see the week's newest campaign ads. Friday beginning at 5 p.m. and again Sunday night at 9:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Next on C-SPAN, we take you to Capitol Hill for a report on the investigation into the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. The Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics and International Operations has been studying BCCI for more than 3 years, beginning with an investigation into the bank's ties with General Manuel Noriega of Panama. Last year, BCCI officials were indicted in a number of nations, including the United States and Great Britain. The charges: fraud and money laundering. Earlier today, 2 members of the Foreign Relations Subcommittee, Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts and Senator Hank Brown of Colorado, spoke with reporters about the conclusions of the subcommittee study.
Good morning, all. I would like to just take a moment, if I may, at the outset of this, before going into the report, to thank a number of people who have made an effort over 4 or 5 years to try to understand BCCI. First of all, I want to thank Senator Brown. This is a nonpartisan, non-political report, at least from our view, both of us, a Democrat and a Republican. There would be no report if it were not for Senator Brown's and his staff's commitment to working in a joint, open effort. From the moment that he arrived in the Senate and became a partner of mine in this, he and his staff have spent countless hours helping to understand BCCI. I personally think that he has shown courage and commitment to follow through on this. As both of us would attest, there have often been pressures and considerations. We've tried to be responsible, we've tried to be fair. But he's been a terrific partner, and this report would not be here today without him. Secondly, there are a number of staff people. You know, government is quick to be criticized, and we deserve a lot of it, that's for certain. But I will tell you that I have never seen a number of staff people work as many incredible hours in the best sense of public service as they have here. And I want to particularly thank Carter Pilcher of Senator Brown's staff, Bennett Rayleigh, Bill Brack, all of whom put a lot of hours into this and helped make this happen. I want to thank Jonathan Weiner, David McCain of my staff, who have worked for a long period of time on this. And I want to thank Dick McCall, who used to be with me on this, and finally Jack Blum, who had the courage to continue this and press it even when Congress seemed to resist it, and who really helped to get it to the person who is one of the great heroes of this effort, and that's Bob Morgenthau in New York. Now, that said, we are releasing today the culmination of their work, our work. And after 4 years, we are together, Senator Brown and I, issuing to the Foreign Relations Committee of the United States Senate a report which concludes and sets out, I think, a path of understanding BCCI as well as a path for future investigation. We do not claim, as we stand before you today, that everything that is to be known is known today. And we do not claim that there are not areas that still need to be investigated. There are. We feel, however, that together we have made clear to people what those areas are and what the legitimacy of the inquiry into those areas is. Now, this report tells a graphic story about international crime that has broken all the rules and in the process brought a lot of people to a downfall. Innocent people, people who were both wittingly and unwittingly drawn into the vortex of BCCI. It is a report that issues a clear call for governments to join together more effectively to deal with this question of international financial crime. It is inexcusable that there remain openly operating havens for dirty money that contribute to the destabilization of the entire financial network and that literally aid in the crime that is a scourge in our streets and in our communities. And more than anything, we would like this report to be looked at in the larger, not in the narrower sense. It is a report that condemns certain current financial practices in the international marketplace. It is imperative for law enforcement's ability to work better, that governments, particularly in the G10, begin to consider similar systems and joint efforts that will help create accountability in the extraordinary flow of large sums of money in a totally unaccountable fashion. While these people are not the people on the street selling the drugs, they are not the people hitting people over the head, their actions have every much that consequence, and it has to be stopped. BCCI constituted international global crime of a level that boggles the mind. Frauds compounded on frauds, including some of the most prominent political figures in the Middle East, like Kamal Adham and Gaith Farone. BCCI systematically bribed political figures around the world, and some of them included heads of states. What's clear is that BCCI's strategy was to find a way into the corridors of political power and to find the most important and prominent people in every country in which they did business. I don't know of a country in which they did business that they did not do that. Institutional barriers to the flow of important information concerning BCCI's criminal activities hampered our government's investigation of BCCI. When the CIA found out a long time ago that BCCI secretly owned a U.S. bank, it didn't tell the Federal Reserve or the Justice Department. It told two other agencies, the Treasury and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, who did nothing with that information. Regulators in both the United States and the United Kingdom misunderstood the nature of the threat posed by BCCI and without realizing it, allowed BCCI to commit crimes in both countries for years without detection. Regulatory oversight was inadequate in both countries until 1991, only 6 months before the bank was closed down for good. Controls on BCCI failed everywhere. BCCI's accountants knew for years that BCCI's record-keeping was poor and that there was bad practice upon bad practice at the bank's various offices. Finally, things got so bad at the same time as District Attorney Morgenthau was about to indict that they let the Bank of England know, and then the Bank of England delayed unconscionably in the period of time before the bank was in fact closed. Millions of depositors were hurt in that process. I might add that in a report that is almost that is 800 pages long, Senator Brown and I disagree on very little. Where we had a few disagreements, and there were a few, we have his views and my views, but I think out of all of those pages, there are about 6 pages that represent that kind of disagreement. There is more to say, obviously, and we're going to deal with a lot of it in questions, but I'm really delighted to have been joined in this effort by the senator from Colorado, and I turn it over to him now. Thank you.
John, thank you. We're both anxious to get to your questions. I wanted simply to cover a couple aspects, though, that I think are critically important. First of all, to give you some additional idea of the scope of this. We're dealing with 79 countries in what I believe is perhaps the broadest spanning criminal conspiracy the world's seen, certainly from a private banking group. I believe it is critically important as an outcome of our investigation that additional legislation come forward. Senator Kerry has already offered significant proposals of his own before I joined the investigation, specifically relating to money laundering. We have jointly co-sponsored 3 separate pieces of legislation that in one form or another will be enacted. And I think you'll see additional legislation specifically focused on banking havens designed to cater to criminal activity. There is no reason in the world that our banking authorities ought to permit banking havens to operate as a way to undercut regulatory safeguards throughout the world. So whether it's Grand Cayman or others that are involved in what I believe is some involvement in the criminal conspiracy, I believe the process will not be finished until those banking havens are dealt with. I think it's important to note the scope of what happened around the world, because the case is the same in many, many locations. In Nigeria, BCCI's activities were discovered by officials who had not been compromised, but the investigators were stopped by top Nigerian officials, both of religious and governmental origin. In Pakistan, BCCI used payoffs to politicians as a mechanism for securing businesses and stopping the bringing to light their illegal practices. In the United Kingdom, the BCCI penetrated deeply. They had a number of branches, and it wasn't until years after American law enforcement authorities began to spot the activities of BCCI that they began to act. The record around the world is replete with areas where they were simply not spotted, their schemes were not detected. And I think there is some point of pride in the fact that the American authorities were the first to bring them to justice. I want to cover just briefly, though, some of the people I believe are the real heroes in this operation. And there are real heroes in this. First, one who is with us, a prosecutor who led the Tampa prosecution since 1986. He's noted for an incredible drive and a tough demeanor, and he was chiefly responsible for the prosecution of the BCCI officers. Is described by associates, he's described as all he likes to do is smoke cigarettes and put bad guys in jail. Mark Jakowski, are you here? Will you stand up? Mark, will you wave to everybody? Mark does not have a cigarette with him, and I don't know if he plans to put anyone here in jail. But I can tell you, this is an individual who has made an incredible contribution to law enforcement in this country through incredibly long hours of dedicated service and made a real difference. There are other heroes. I think Greg Kehoe is here as well, who was his assistant in the prosecution efforts. Greg, thank you for your efforts. Bob Major, the undercover customs agent who first developed the idea of Operation Sea Chase back in 1986. He masterminded the plan, and he was the chief undercover agent, and he put his life on the line for this country. There are others who have done the same thing, but I want to mention several others in handouts that we will make available to you if any of you are interested. But there's an additional hero in my book, and that's John Kerry. You will notice as you go through the report, it is filled with names of prominent public officials. There was not a single committee of this Congress that was willing to conduct a thorough, complete investigation of this problem. It was partly because so many prominent officials were deeply involved in this. In putting together this report, not only embarrasses them, but exposes many to criminal prosecution. That is not easy to do, particularly when some of them are members of your own party. No one stepped forward to do it, except John Kerry. And he's carried forward this fight no matter how tough it was, how difficult it was, or how embarrassing it was. In my book, that makes a real hero, along with the other heroes that helped bring this to light. The point is not that bad things don't happen. They do. The point is that we in a democracy take the steps to bring them to light and to solve the problems. One of my deepest disappointments is the activities of the Central Intelligence Agency. They had a report which could have put a stop to BCCI early on, years before it came to an end. And I believe if they had acted properly, could have saved the depositors around the world literally tens of millions or perhaps even hundreds of millions of dollars. The deepest disappointment is not just that the CIA failed to deliver that intelligence information to the proper authorities who could act on it, but even to this day are unable to clearly identify who was responsible. Perhaps I should say either unable or unwilling to identify clearly who was responsible. That kind of activity is not acceptable, and it's one of the fundamental changes that I believe must take place. John, if you're ready, we might go ahead with questions.
Can I have the report? Let me say as we open up, I could not concur more with Hank Brown's comments regarding those who prosecuted this case and made the effort at the grassroots level. There was a tremendous effort. And while I have pointed out that I thought there were some higher level decisions that might have been different, that in no way impugns the commitment or the efforts of those who really engaged on a day-to-day basis with this and brought this prosecution to fruit, and they indeed deserve enormous credit. We're open to questions. Yes.
You've said in the past that you regard it as a conflict of interest, James Lake representing Abu Dhabi and continuing to be Bush's deputy campaign manager. Do you still feel that?
Well, my record is very clear on that statement, and I stand by the statement. What disturbs us, obviously, is that in the last week or so, literally just as this report was about to come out, Abu Dhabi made available here in Washington certain documents for perusal by our law enforcement authorities. Our authorities are allowed to go in and look at them. They cannot take notes and they cannot take copies. There is a very selected group of documents that have been made available. The fact is that the body of evidence that would shed light on this remains in Abu Dhabi. And our government at the highest level needs to make it clear to the government of Abu Dhabi that it is important to get to the bottom of it. That has not happened. Now, I don't know why it hasn't happened, but it just plain hasn't happened. So there is, in my mind, a continuing appearance of a problem. I'm not trying to politicize this. It's there. It's a problem. Now, I would also say that the Bank of England, by hanging on the way it did for the period of time that it did, and by permitting the fraud, in a sense, to continue for the period of time that it did, acquiesced in the movement of millions of documents from London to Abu Dhabi. Had they moved immediately, as they should have, based on the type of fraud that was in evidence to them at that time, those documents would now be available to appropriate authorities, we would hope, including the United States.
I just add on that, it is my personal feeling that Abu Dhabi has not fully cooperated. They have cooperated to a limited extent, but not to a full extent. And as you review the report, I believe you'll come to the same conclusion I have, which is that Abu Dhabi's role in this is far more significant than was originally put forth.
Harry, can you talk to us about the role of the Bank of England and what recommendations you would make to the British?
I'm not a British legislator, and I'm not going to be so arrogant as to suggest to them what they do with our facts. Some will probably suggest there's an arrogance in our having pointed out the facts we have. I regret that, but we have tried to be straightforward in suggesting, in just laying out what we found. What British authorities and their parliamentary system decides to do with it is up to them. And I'd be happy to consult, as I know Senator Brown would be happy to consult. But I think that their system needs to decide how it wants to respond to the facts that we have laid forward.
Whether there's positive evidence or not, you've used the words acquiesce, negligence, willful or unwillful, or to what degree do you think there was affirmative action by the executive branch to hide the truth or to create the set of events which led to this affair?
By our executive branch? We have no overt evidence or direct evidence that somebody made a malicious decision in this to not proceed. We have laid out a series of decisions that were made, some of which we have disagreed with. It is clear that there was poor communication. It is clear there were inadequate resources. It is clear that on a couple of occasions people interceded where perhaps they shouldn't have, but there's no showing, to my mind, that there was an overall effort to somehow shut it down. I just don't think the evidence shows that.
Nor is there a feeling in your gut that that might have happened, even if there's no evidence.
I don't want to deal with gut feelings here. This is a factual report. We've tried to lay out the facts. I think it would be a mistake to reduce it to gut feeling. Senator Brown.
Well, let me just add on that, if I could. John, you may have a different view of this, but at least it was my feeling as you look at this, that if there is a failing in that area, it is a failing to devote enough resources quickly enough to pursue quickly enough in that area. And one of the heroes that we did not go in depth to is the prosecutor from New York. Bob Morgenthau has clearly done an outstanding job in this area and exemplifies the kind of rapid follow-up that I think we had wished we'd seen more of on the federal level.
Yeah, I simply wanted to say that I think that I expressed in the course of the hearings and in the course of these proceedings a disagreement with how this case should have been viewed. I think early on there was sufficient evidence to view the broad scope of criminality. And in fact, that was the argument that Jack Blum made when he first went at this. And when he went to Bob Morgenthau, in point of fact, Bob Morgenthau saw the broad scope and indicted on the broader scope. So people, you know, we're not here to try to go rat-a-tat to a lot of folks who made different judgments. We're simply trying to show what happened over the course of time. And it's clear that Bob Morgenthau's judgment has been found to be the correct one.
Senator Kerry, can you talk about Capcom for a second? You say that it's evident, the evidence is clear that there was money laundering, and yet the commodity regulators say they never did find money laundering. What happened there?
Well, we disagree on that. Capcom, we believe, represents one of the parts of the iceberg that is still underwater. It ought to be more properly investigated. We also believe that the regulatory process in Chicago of the Commodities Future Exchange and Board of Trade is not sufficient, that it doesn't have a way of dealing with this, and since money laundering is not per se outlawed, as it ought to be, you have a problem. Now, I commend you. I can't go through all of it here, but I think that you will understand what I'm talking about in terms of scope of this investigation when you go to page 786 of Volume 2. Matters for further investigation, if any of you ever get there. This way I'm sort of getting you there faster. There are 20 different areas which we believe merit investigation, ranging from the financing of commodities and other business dealings, of international financial people involved, to BCCI's activities with the Central Bank of Syria and the Foreign Trade Mission of the Soviet Union, involvement in terrorism, involvement in bankrolling a nuclear plant in Pakistan, the manipulation of the commodities and securities markets in both Europe and Canada. Major issues, folks. These leap out at you. And the commodities and Capcom is one of those areas.
Let me just ask you, though, with Bromrell and Magnus, the U.S. investors in Capcom, you do call Clifford and Altman culpable even if they were duped. What about Bromrell and Magnus? Are they culpable even if they were duped?
We didn't make that judgment.
I'd like to ask a little bit more about the question of the illegal acquisition of First American. In particular, you said in your introductory remarks, and you say very briefly in the report, that the CIA did notify the Treasury that this illegal acquisition had taken place. But as far as I can see, you don't go into any more detail than that. And I was wondering if you could tell us what you know about who knew at Treasury, how high it went, if you have any sense about why they failed to pursue it, and what you believe the significance of Treasury's action was, please.
Let me comment briefly on that, and perhaps Sean will have an additional comment. My concern about the failure of communication from the CIA was that they contacted the wrong people. What you had was the CIA gets some very significant information. The analogy is really to a fire starting. And instead of calling the fire department, they called the zoning commission. Did they call someone with the information? Yes, but they called the wrong people. They did not call the people who had responsibility for regulating and dealing with BCCI. So the failure there, I think, is simply the failure to recognize the significance of the information, to get it to the right people, or even to follow up. There is an indication they did forward it to Treasury, but there again, the people at Treasury did not share it with the appropriate or follow up.
It's interesting, it also went to the highest up level of Treasury. It was shared at the highest level.
Are you saying the Secretary? Are you saying that James Baker knew?
No, it was not Jim Baker. At the time, it was Don Regan.
And so he knew that BCCI owned
He
First
was
American.
given it. There is evidence that went to him. He is on the memo. He is the addressee. He has no memory of it.
Can I follow on this point? You singled out CIA for criticism. In your investigation here in the U.S., what individuals or agencies bear responsibility for not being on top of this?
I think the report speaks for itself.
What were you?
We have,
You already singled out CIA. Who would you add to that list?
well, we feel that the regulators, the Fed should have moved sooner, we felt. We felt that the relationship between the Office of the Controller of the Currency and the other regulatory financial institutions was not adequate in terms of communication. We've made differing judgments on nuance, but fundamentally have felt that justice should have had the resources allocated and should have moved harder. And I think that's it. So I think that's what's been laid out.
What about individuals? Do you want to name some people who are culpable?
No, I think the report speaks for itself on that. You know, this is an institutional failure more than it is individuals. And the institutions were somehow not geared to respond or to be able to respond. There are some individuals here and there who made either judgments we disagree with or judgments we think, or no judgment. But I think there was a failure in the process as much as anything, and I think that's what we're trying to underscore.
Let me just add a thought on that. I think it's important to put this in perspective. The United States, unlike many of the foreign countries we talked about, Nigeria and others, was not the subject of graft or corruption. At least we have no evidence of that. The United States was the first to move in this area and prosecuted far ahead of other nations. So in a significant measure, we have a lot to be proud of. The United States was much more difficult to penetrate. The United States did to depositors that other nations did. In terms of perspective, we come out far better than the other nations that were subject to this. It is appropriate, though, and I think the report does it, to focus on our shortcomings, even though there's a lot, I think, to take pride in. It's appropriate to focus on the shortcomings, and I think the report tries to do that in a balanced manner.
Senator Kerry, you're mentioning in the Bank of England section here that the bank withheld information it had on fraud for 15 months. What are you saying there? Why did the bank do that in your view? And is it fair to suggest here from what you're saying that we're talking about the Bank of England being directly or indirectly a party to the cover-up of the fraud? Or what is it exactly you're saying about the bank?
I am saying very directly that the Bank of England had sufficient information in front of it to close BCCI 15 months earlier than it did. And I am suggesting very directly that it was the process of Bob Morgenthau and the imminent indictments that moved them to action and not the gravity of the case itself. I don't know how long it might have been clear to us what the sequence of events was at that point in time.
Why do you think the Bank of England is having them?
I don't want to speculate, and I can't answer the question.
Second question, you do state, however, explicitly that Abu Dhabi was involved in covering up through hiding witnesses and still hiding documents. You state explicitly that Mr. al-Mazrui was personally involved in some of the financial benefits from BCCI. He is the current head of the BCCI investigation in Abu Dhabi. And you also say that Abu Dhabi was a nominee for which other people have been indicted. Are you suggesting that there's a reasonable suggestion here that Abu Dhabi might be indicted, should be investigated?
I think it is being investigated, and I think you should stay tuned.
It is being investigated about possible
District Attorney Bob
culpability.
Morgenthau is investigating all aspects of this case. And I am convinced that he will continue, and if there is evidence there that merits some kind of action, I'm convinced he will take action. He is currently looking at that very issue.
Senator Brown,
Go ahead.
you said a few moments ago that there was no graft or corruption in this country. As you know, for weeks, maybe months, rumors of payoff list floated.
Wait a minute.
Rumors of a payoff list floated around Washington and elsewhere.
Must be a tough question if it's
Understanding the difficulty of proving a negative, are you confident that that's all they were, rumors? Or is it conceivable that there's just something you didn't find?
I had difficulty enough getting to our almost 800 pages. I'm not sure I'm ready to go beyond that at this point. What we've said is we don't have evidence of the graft or corruption or bribes at this point. Does that guarantee that there weren't any? No, it does not. And obviously, as has been referred to earlier, there are significant areas that we think remain uninvestigated and need follow-up.
Do you need an independent counsel on this investigation? Do you favor each senator an independent counsel?
Well, I think there is an independent counsel right now. His name's Bob Morgenthau.
Limited staff, limited resources.
He seems to be doing a hell of a job. If he needs more resources and more staff, my understanding is that the relationship between he and Attorney General Barr now is good. It's my understanding that the Justice Department is working closely with him. I think there's been good cooperation there in recent months. And I think we have every reason to believe that this investigation can go forward. I can assure you that if Bob thought he wasn't capable of doing it, he'd be the first person to say so.
You said that there was no graft or corruption in this country and that we should be proud of that, but you also list a pattern.
We said there was no evidence.
You also list a pattern of buying of influence, buying the services of well-connected people that makes it look as if this bank was treated us the way they treated all those third world countries and got away with it. That doesn't seem to be something we should be proud of.
I think the report is very clear about I think when Senator Brown, and I sort of listened carefully when he said that, what he was talking about was the lack of evidence of payoffs to high political figures, to within businesses, and the lack of evidence of the kind of pattern of corruption that we found in other countries. A direct link between money given or action taken and subsequent action taken. Now that is absent here, but we have very clearly laid out in this report actions that were taken in this country that were illegal and for which people are currently obviously either under indictment or under investigation. So there is clearly a corruption in this country, but it is of a different kind than the kind that I think he's referring to. He can speak for himself, but that's the way I understood it.
What did you need Senator Hatch out of the report?
Senator Hatch is, first of all, there's been a great deal of mention of Senator Hatch in recent days publicly. This committee has no jurisdiction whatsoever over the investigation of another senator. We have included in there the memorandum of the staffer, and the staffer himself is mentioned. Senator Hatch himself has sent that issue to the Ethics Committee. And so it's really within the hands of the Ethics Committee and not us. And therefore, we thought it was inappropriate to include people who are really not within the purview of the investigation.
Will you be writing to the Senate Ethics Committee about it?
Writing, I don't know, but they've contacted us and asked us for some information.
The Price Waterhouse role involved in this, how far and how high within Pricewaterhouse do you think there was evidence of corruption? And particularly in relation to the question of provision of sexual favours to certain Pricewaterhouse staff.
I said you do it before he got there.
Being the only CPA in the Senate, it's always seemed to be an honor up until now. I don't know what clearly that Price Waterhouse report was critical in laying open much of the information that had remained a mystery. So the Price Waterhouse report and the availability of it is a key break in opening this case up. In terms of specific charges against them, I'm not aware of them. Perhaps
there's a swirl of allegation about sexual favors being given in one form or another throughout a lot of BCCI's activities. I know some of the dailies in London will not like us for having not included all of them, but we didn't really think this ought to be a report about that kind of allegation. We did include some of it where we thought it was relevant, but I don't think it needs further comment.
But did you think that corruption or bribery or blackmail or nefarious dealings had prevented Pricewaterhouse from coming clean on this sooner, or was it just mismanagement or malmanagement by Pricewaterhouse that it didn't reveal?
I really think the report speaks very clearly to that, and since it is complicated and there are a sequence of events, I think you need to pick from the report very carefully. We do make it very clear that there was, in our mind, a very direct conflict of interest between lending from BCCI to Pricewaterhouse accountants who were directly involved in the accounting process. Now that just leaps out at you as a conflict and raises very serious questions of practice.
Let me add just a note on that. If those of you who are interested in that aspect of it and choose to write on it or delve into it, please keep in mind one significant aspect of this. Pricewaterhouse is a monolith. The operation in England is a different operation in very significant aspects, not totally, but significant aspects, than it is in other locations, specifically the United States. Different partners, different partnership arrangements, different responsibilities, different personnel. It is a dramatically different operation, and I think that's an important factor to keep in mind if it's dealt with.
Gary, if a U.S. institution, supervisory institution, had conducted itself in the same way in this case as the Bank of England conducted itself, would you as senators be pressing for heads to roll at the very top of that institution?
Well, I think you have a pretty good understanding of American politics. I don't want to deal with a hypothetical. I'm not trying to duck it. That's not what happened, and therefore there's no reason to start calling for hypothetical heads that might become real.
Is there any truth in the report, in the rumour, that the British government officials, either at Treasury or at the Bank of England, requested a delay in the publication of the report so that government ministers wouldn't be in this country?
No truth whatsoever. The delay in the publication of this report, about a week and a half or so, was really due to the PLW MIA hearings that Senator Brown and I are both involved in. And we just got behind. And as you can imagine, in trying to edit this and deal with this intelligently, it was more time consuming than we thought.
You talked about the BCCI as a banking conspiracy that abetted other forms of international criminal conspiracy, and you've assailed the CIA, which may in fact have been a BCCI customer. But is there anything in your recommendations and in the outcome of all of this that impacts on the ordinary American bank depositor, or ways that your recommendations might make him or her more secure?
Prior to my involvement, but still unresolved, is a final method of dealing with these banking havens. And that problem still should be of concern. Now, Americans have a separate system that has worked reasonably well under these circumstances, but the international problem and the potential for an international conspiracy using the banking system is still there, in my view.
Let me add also a couple of things. You know, the average depositor in the United States may sit there and say, well, how does this affect me and how did I get whacked by it? the Encino Bank in California cost the taxpayer some money. Now, as Senator Brown said, while they didn't penetrate as rapidly here as they did elsewhere, and that's to credit of our system, they were doing it. And had they succeeded in going further, obviously, this could have exposed a great deal more money and could have been much more convoluted, because if they collapsed with greater liabilities, et cetera, you would have had more American institutions subjected to lawsuits and the potential of loss within that network. But more importantly, frankly, what BCCI means to the average depositor, I think, in this country, is that if there is an international system and all of us are playing by one set of rules, but there's another set of rules out there that is enticing our own businesses and banks to compete by the different set of rules, then we are really creating a network that undermines the stability of our own system and the accountability of it. That affects every taxpayer, not just every depositor. And ultimately, if you have places where money can go that is dirty money, and it can go easily, you are aiding and abetting every criminal enterprise there is, because these are the people who profit from it and pay the least for their endeavors. It's the hardest to get at. Ask any prosecutor. And so if you can move billions of dollars in large sums in seconds electronically without ever knowing where it came from, and move it from 5 different locations very rapidly, you can cloud any criminal trail extremely easily. The banking community at Basel decided that they would live by the standard of know your customer. That's supposed to be the key to banking. The fact is that electronic transfers and wire transfers without accountability defy the notion of knowing your customer. And they are totally contrary to any capacity for accountability. We are all at risk when that is true. Moreover, our companies in this country and our banks are living by one standard and trying to compete in an international marketplace where people are able to move this money more freely, without restraint, without accountability, without the same penalties, and without the same restraints. That is a huge competitive disadvantage.
One more question. Would you make any recommendations to the British government of what they should do?
I answered that earlier.
No, I think that's been answered. The report speaks for itself, but no, we didn't view our responsibility as making recommendations for the British. We tried it a couple hundred years ago. It didn't work very well. And,
what's the most important thing?
Can I also comment on one other thing? I really commend you, if I can, to not just the series of legislative recommendations we made, which we think summarize this, but to the findings themselves as we've laid them out, because I think that's the only way that it makes clear what we're talking about in terms of this network.
What's the most important thing the administration can do to crack this case? Is it pressuring Abu Dhabi, and if so, how would you suggest they do it?
There are 2 places where the secrets to this case lie. One is in Abu Dhabi, and the other is with Mr. Abadi in Pakistan. The most fruitful would be Abu Dhabi, where you have key high players under so-called house arrest and where you have millions of documents.
So what should the administration do to get them together?
Well, the administration has all kinds of tools at its disposal in terms of relationships within the region, pressures it can bring to bear. I mean, everybody knows the various pressures we have diplomatically, in the marketplace, in relationships, in arms dealings, in all kinds of things. And I think we need to make clear our determination to pursue this.
There's one other thing I hope the administration will do, and perhaps it's a joint responsibility with Congress, but it does fall heavily on the administration. That is, we have to move quickly, I think, to terminate the ability of banking havens to operate. And if that means cutting off wire transfers between those entities, if it means restricting access to institutions in those countries, this nation has to move, I believe, quickly to cut off access and commerce with nations that would use a banking system for criminal conspiracies.
I'm advised by staff, I goofed on one thing, and I just want to correct it so there's no record incorrect here. Abu Dhabi has allowed them to take notes. It has not allowed them to make copies. So I just want to correct that. I'd said they couldn't make notes. They can make notes.
The purpose being that without copies, you can't have them
They can't
used
put
in an
anything into
American
evidence.
court, right?
Correct. You have no document to put into court. You also have limited documents because they've been selectively provided. You don't know what the vast body of the documents might be.
One more question. That's it. Thank you all.
Thank you all very much.
Good job.
Thank you. But I think we
The Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Narcotics, Terrorism, and International Operations has been investigating the Bank of Credit and Commerce International since 1988. Over the last year, their investigation has focused on allegations of fraud and money laundering. Back in July, former Defense Secretary Clark Clifford and his law partner Robert Altman were indicted in federal and in state courts on charges of bank fraud and accepting bribes. The charges stem from an alleged conspiracy to allow BCCI to gain secret control of the Washington, D.C.-based First American Bank, which the two men directed. For more information on this briefing, write to the Foreign Relations Subcommittee. The address is 446 Dirksen Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. The zip code is 20510. Meet the people behind the titles on book notes. This week, Derek Bell, author of Faces at the Bottom of the Well, is our guest. Mr. Bell, a civil rights activist and author, examines the role of racism in American society. Through stories blending imagination and real-life experiences, Mr. Bell writes about issues